Before we begin, remember, this is a fictional story crafted from imagination, not reality. All characters are adults, and every relationship depicted is consensual. This is a space for dark romance, where shadows and desire intertwine. Step carefully and enjoy the story. They called him the Blade of Silence. Draven Thalric, second son of the Blood Sovereign, 19 winters old and already a legend written in the blood of his enemies. A reputation forged not in boasts or threats, but in the terrible quiet that preceded death. He did not speak to those beneath his station, did not acknowledge pleas for mercy, did not hesitate when his father commanded execution. The executioner prince, they whispered in the corridors of the Crimson Keep. Beautiful as winter dawn, deadly as nightshade. His presence emptied rooms. Even high generals, men who had commanded armies and survived sieges, averted their eyes when he passed. He was precision incarnate, a killing instrument wrapped in royal flesh, every movement calculated, every breath measured. Until the night a kitchen servant spilled wine across his boots during a state banquet and, instead of begging forgiveness, looked him dead in the eye and said, "Your reflexes are slower than I expected. A warrior of your reputation should have moved." The great hall fell silent. 300 nobles held their breath, waiting for blood to spill. The servant should have died where she stood, cut down for such insolence. Everyone knew what the Blade of Silence did to those who disrespected him. Instead, something impossible happened. Draven smiled. Not the cruel twist of lips before violence, not the cold smirk of calculated cruelty. A real smile, surprised, almost boyish, as though something long dormant had suddenly stirred awake. And then he laughed. A low, warm sound that shocked the entire assembly into frozen disbelief. 3 weeks earlier, my story began. My name is Lasara. I am nothing, or at least, I was nothing. 22 winters old, 5th-tier kitchen servant in the Crimson Keep, invisible among the thousands who kept the fortress running. My days blurred together in endless repetition. I peeled vegetables until my fingers cramped. I scrubbed pots until the copper shone. I slept in quarters smaller than a noble's closet, on a thin mattress that smelled of mildew and exhaustion. I had been at the keep for 8 months, long enough to understand the hierarchy of fear that governed every interaction, long enough to learn the rules of survival. The Blood Sovereign ruled through terror. Public executions, brutal punishments, a throne built on the bones of those who defied him. His eldest son, Crown Prince Kale, ruled through cunning and political manipulation, a different kind of danger. But Draven, the second son, he ruled through something else entirely. Perfect, silent violence. He does not tolerate errors, the head cook warned me on my first day, her weathered face grave with concern. One mistake in his presence, one misstep, and you will simply disappear. No trial, no questions. They say he killed a servant once for coughing during dinner. That cannot possibly be true, I said, horrified. The servant is gone. The prince never denied it. Draw your own conclusions. She gripped my shoulder. Stay invisible, stay silent, and never, ever look him in the eye. For 8 months, I followed those rules. I learned to move like smoke, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to never make eye contact with anyone wearing the Thalric crimson. I became a ghost, existing in the spaces between notice and neglect. Until the night of the harvest banquet changed everything. The Blade of Silence wore his title like armor, and the stories about him were endless. I had seen Draven from a distance many times, tall, built with the lean muscle of a warrior who trained relentlessly, hair black as obsidian cut sharp at his shoulders, eyes the color of winter storms, pale gray and cold as frost. The courtiers said he was beautiful in the way blades are beautiful, lethal elegance, something that drew the eye even as it promised death. But it was his stillness that truly unsettled people. He never fidgeted, never shifted his weight unnecessarily, never made a wasted movement. He existed in perfect control, and when he did move, it was with such fluid precision that seasoned warriors flinched at the sight. The stories followed him everywhere. 27 executions by his own hand, traitors, criminals, political inconveniences. His father's will made manifest through Draven's sword. No hesitation, no mercy, just cold, efficient death delivered with the same expression he wore when signing documents or dining at formal tables. Some said he had killed his first man at 14. Others claimed he felt nothing at all, that his heart had frozen over after his mother's assassination and never thawed. I was assigned to serve the high table during the harvest banquet as punishment for someone else's mistake. One of the senior servants had fallen ill, and someone had to fill the gap. The head cook gave me simple instructions that felt like a death sentence. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not look at them directly. Pour wine, remove plates, be invisible. Can you manage that? Yes, ma'am. And Sarah, she added, her voice dropping. If Prince Draven is there, do not even breathe louder than necessary. Do you understand? I understood. I understood that I was terrified. The banquet hall blazed with candlelight, hundreds of flames reflecting off polished armor and jeweled goblets. 300 nobles, merchants, and foreign dignitaries packed the massive space, their conversations creating a low roar of sound. At the high table, raised on a dais so everyone could see the royal family's power, the blood sovereign presided over the feast like a king of ravens. Crown Prince Kale sat at his right hand, charming and dangerous, smiling at guests with perfect political grace. And at his left sat Draven, the blade of silence, expressionless, untouchable, a statue carved from ice and violence. I approached the high table with the wine, my heart hammering so hard I was certain everyone could hear it. My hands were steady, though. I had practiced this 1,000 times. I knew every movement, every angle. I poured for the blood sovereign first. He did not acknowledge my existence. I poured for Crown Prince Kale. He glanced at me with mild curiosity, then returned to his conversation. Then I moved to Draven. Everything was perfect. My movements were smooth, professional, invisible. Until a drunken noble behind me lurched backward from his table, stumbling directly into my elbow. Red wine splashed across Draven's boots. Expensive black leather, now stained deep crimson, the color of blood. Time seemed to slow. Horror flooded through me like ice water. This was death. This was exactly how I died. I should have dropped to my knees immediately, pressed my forehead to the floor, begged for mercy with every breath in my body. Instead, I looked at him, directly at him, breaking the most fundamental rule. And somehow, impossibly, I heard myself say, "Your reflexes are slower than I expected. A warrior of your reputation should have moved." The hall went silent. Not gradually, but all at once, like someone had cut the strings of every conversation simultaneously. 300 people stopped breathing. Servants froze mid-step. Musicians' hands stilled on their instruments. The blood sovereign turned his head slowly, expression unreadable. Crown Prince Kale leaned forward, eyes gleaming with anticipation of bloodshed. Draven stared at me. His eyes, ice gray and penetrating, searched my face with an intensity that felt like being dissected. I waited for his hand to move to the blade at his hip, waited for the killing strike that would end this moment of insanity. Instead, his expression shifted. Something flickered behind those cold eyes. Surprise, recognition, and then, impossibly, amusement. He smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed his entire face, softening the hard lines, lighting something warm in those winter storm eyes. Then he laughed, a low, warm sound that seemed to shock him as much as it shocked everyone else. "You are absolutely right," he said, his voice smoother and warmer than I had ever imagined. "I should have anticipated drunk nobility. That was entirely my fault." He waved a dismissive hand at his wine-stained boots. "Clean it later. The wine adds character, I think. Makes them look less pretentious." Then he returned to his meal as though nothing had happened, as though he had not just spared the life of a servant who had insulted him in front of the entire court, leaving me standing there, alive, confused, and utterly lost. The aftermath of that night shook the keep to its foundations. Servants whispered in every corner, their voices urgent with disbelief. The Blade of Silence laughed, actually laughed, during a state banquet. I heard it myself, a real laugh, not cruel or mocking, genuine. Who was the servant? Some nobody, Lysera, fifth-tier kitchen girl. What did she do? Spilled wine on him, insulted him to his face. He found it amusing. The head cook pulled me aside that night, her expression caught between relief and terror. "What possessed you to speak to him like that? Have you lost your mind?" "I do not know," I admitted, my voice shaking with delayed shock. "I thought I was dead anyway. The words just came out. I could not stop them." "Well, you are still alive, which is more than anyone expected." She gripped both my shoulders. "But stay away from him now. That was luck, not favor. Lightning does not strike the same place twice." But 4 days later, I was scrubbing floors in the East Wing, my hands raw from lye soap, when I heard footsteps. Measured, precise footsteps that I somehow recognized before I looked up. Draven stood in the corridor, watching me with an expression I could not read. I immediately dropped my gaze, bowed my head, fear spiking through me. "Your Highness." The Blood Sovereign summoned me 3 months after the wine incident. I had never been in his actual presence before, never stood in the throne room facing the man who ruled through fear and violence. The room was vast and cold, designed to intimidate. Black iron and crimson banners. The sovereign sat on his throne of dark metal, a man carved from violence and pragmatic cruelty, scars crossing his face and hands. "You are Lysera," he said. Not a question, a statement. "Yes, Your Majesty." My voice did not shake, though my knees wanted to. "My son has been different since meeting you." Terror spiked through me. "I have done nothing improper, Your Majesty, I swear it." "He laughs," the sovereign interrupted, his voice cutting through my panic. "He engages with people beyond issuing orders. He seems almost human again." I did not know what to say. The most powerful man in the realm was talking to me about his son's laughter. The sovereign leaned forward, his expression weary in a way that made him look older. "I made him into a weapon. After his mother was assassinated, after the betrayals and treachery that nearly destroyed this family, I taught him that emotion was weakness. that mercy was a liability that would get him killed. I forged him into the blade of silence because I thought it would keep him alive. He stood, approached me with heavy steps. But I broke something in him, something fundamental, something I do not know how to repair and cannot replace. Your Majesty, You did what I could not, he said, his voice rough. You reminded him he is more than just a tool, more than my instrument of execution. He looked me in the eye. Do not stop. Whatever you are doing, continue. He needs it more than he needs anything else I could give him, more than crowns or armies or political marriages. I am simply his friend, Your Majesty. Then be his friend, the Blood Sovereign said. The realm has enough executioners. My son deserves to be more than that. 3 months later, everything changed again. We were in the archives, late evening, candles burning low. Draven was reading old treaties. I was cataloging forgotten texts, enjoying the quiet companionship. Lasara, he said suddenly. Yes? I need to tell you something. I set down my quill, turned to face him. His expression was serious, almost nervous. What is it? I am in love with you. The words hung in the air like a blade before it falls. What? He set down his book, turned to face me fully, his ice-gray eyes holding mine. I know this is impossible in every practical way. You are a servant. I am a prince. My father would likely oppose a marriage despite approving our friendship. The court would riot. Political alliances would fracture. He moved closer, and I could see his hands trembling slightly. But you made me laugh. You made me feel human again after years of being nothing but a weapon. You see me as Draven, not the blade, not the executioner, not the tool of my father's will. Just a man. His voice dropped. I have spent years being a weapon, and I am good at it. But with you, I remember what it is to be alive, what it is to want something beyond duty and death. My heart was racing so hard I could barely breathe. Your father would never allow a marriage, regardless of what he said about friendship. My father told me to keep you close. He knows what you have given me, what you have restored. The court would destroy us both. Let them try. I do not care. He took my hands, and his grip was warm, real, desperate. I am not asking for an answer now, but I needed you to know. You are everything I did not know I needed. Everything I thought I had killed inside myself. I looked at him. This prince everyone feared, this man who had killed without hesitation, who looked at me like I held the sun itself in my hands. I love you too, I whispered. His expression transformed completely. Joy, disbelief, wonder all washing over his face. You do? I have been falling since you smiled at the banquet, I said. Since I realized the executioner prince was just a boy who had forgotten how to be warm, who needed someone to remind him he was allowed to feel. He kissed me then, gentle, reverent, desperate with relief. And I kissed him back, the weapon and the nobody, finding each other in the spaces between duty and fear, between death and life. 8 months later, the announcement shattered the court like breaking glass. Prince Draven would marry a kitchen servant. Nobles protested loudly. Ancient families withdrew support. Political alliances that had stood for generations fractured overnight. The scandal consumed the court. But the blood sovereign backed his son with absolute authority. "Lysera," he said, and my name and his voice made me freeze. He knew my name. The executioner prince knew my name. "Yes, Your Highness," I managed. "No more wine incidents, I trust?" I looked up cautiously. He was almost smiling again, that same expression that had saved my life. "I have been permanently banned from serving the high table, Your Highness, so you are completely safe from my clumsiness." "A tragedy," he said, and there was definite amusement in his voice. "The banquets are dreadfully dull without unexpected commentary." Was he joking? The executioner prince, the man who had killed 27 people, was making jokes with a kitchen servant? "I am certain the nobles provide ample entertainment, Your Highness." "They provide tedium," he corrected. "There is a significant difference." He studied me for a long moment. "You are not afraid of me?" "I was terrified when I spilled the wine." "But not now." "You spared me," I said simply. "Fear seems redundant after mercy." His expression shifted, something thoughtful and almost vulnerable crossing his face. "Most people remain afraid even after mercy. You are unusual." "I peel vegetables for a living, Your Highness. Unusual is an extremely generous assessment." He smiled again, that rare, genuine expression, then walked away without another word, leaving me kneeling on wet stone, wondering what had just happened and why my heart was racing. A pattern began, slow at first, then undeniable. Every few days I would encounter him in unexpected places. Corridors I was cleaning, gardens I was weeding, the library reserves where I borrowed books servants were not technically allowed to touch. He would stop, say something. I would respond honestly, without the careful calculation everyone else used around him. And he would smile. Not the cold mask the court saw, but something real, something unguarded. "You read military philosophy," he observed one evening, finding me in a quiet corner of the library with a borrowed text. "I hope that is acceptable, Your Highness. I try to return them undamaged." "Sun Tzu or Verikai?" "Both. Sun Tzu is elegant. Verikai is brutal but effective." "Which do you prefer?" I considered the question seriously. "Depends on the goal. Elegance for long campaigns where morale matters. Brutality for desperate situations where survival is the only victory." He sat across from me, uninvited, his presence filling the small space. "You think strategically?" "I peel vegetables strategically, Your Highness. Everything else is purely theoretical." "Do you fear me, Lysera?" The question was direct, almost vulnerable. "No, Your Highness." "Why not? Everyone else does, and with good reason." "You have been nothing but courteous to me. Why would I fear courtesy?" "I have killed 27 people." "Were they innocent?" He paused, something dark flickering in his eyes. "No. Traitors, murderers, threats to the realm and my family." "Then you did your duty. That does not make you a monster, Your Highness. It makes you a prince who protects his people." "My father believes fear is the only reliable currency of power." "Your father rules through terror. You could choose differently." Silence stretched between us. Then, quietly, "What if I do not know how?" I looked at him, truly looked, seeing past the perfect control and deadly reputation. Beneath it all, I saw exhaustion, loneliness, A boy taught to be a weapon who had forgotten he was also human. You smiled when I insulted you, I said gently. That was a choice. You chose humor over violence. That is how you begin choosing differently. He studied me for a long moment, those winter gray eyes searching my face. You see things others do not. I watch people, Your Highness. It is easy when you are invisible to them. You are not invisible to me, he said softly, and something in his voice made my breath catch. The shift happened gradually, then all at once. Draven sought me out deliberately, no longer pretending these encounters were a coincidence. Not as prince to servant, but as something else entirely. We talked in empty halls at midnight, in forgotten gardens where old roses grew wild, in the archives where ancient texts gathered dust. He asked my opinions on everything, politics and ethics, the nature of power and the weight of duty. I made him laugh, often, with small observations and honest reactions that caught him off guard. And slowly, week by week, the blade of silence became someone else, someone lighter, someone almost free. The servants noticed the change first. He smiled at a guard yesterday, a real smile, not political or cold, just genuine. He made a joke during weapons training, an actual joke. What is happening to him? That kitchen girl, Lysera, she is changing him. No, an older servant corrected wisely. She is reminding him who he was before his father broke him into a weapon. My second son was dying inside, he declared before the assembled court, his voice carrying to every corner. Becoming the weapon I forged him to be instead of the man he was meant to be. This woman brought him back to life. That is worth infinitely more than any political marriage. The wedding was grand, public, a deliberate statement. Draven stood at the altar in formal crimson and black, smiling openly, no longer hiding behind the mask of the blade of silence. When I walked down the aisle in borrowed silk, he laughed. Bright, joyful, completely unrestrained. What? I asked when I reached him, smiling despite myself. You are not carrying a wine bottle, he said, his eyes dancing. I am genuinely impressed by your restraint. I laughed. The priest laughed. The entire hall laughed, even those who disapproved of everything this marriage represented. Later, at the wedding feast, a young guard approached me nervously. Your Highness, forgive me, but may I ask, how did you change him? The prince used to terrify us all. Now he seems almost human. I looked across the hall. Draven was talking with his brother, both of them smiling. The deadly tension between them finally eased. I did not change him, I said honestly. I just reminded him who he was before fear and duty consumed everything else. Before he forgot he was allowed to be more than a weapon. That night, in our chambers, Draven pulled me close, his arms warm and real around me. Thank you, he said softly. For what? For spilling wine, for insulting me, for not being afraid when everyone else was, for loving me when I had forgotten I was worth loving. I smiled, kissed him gently. You were always worth it. You just needed someone to see past the blade to the person holding it. He kissed my forehead, and I felt him smile against my skin. I was so cold before you, so empty. Everything was duty and death and fear. And now I feel everything. Joy and love and hope. It is terrifying and wonderful. and I would trade nothing for it. You know people still fear you a little, I teased. Good, he said, his eyes warm despite the word. Let them fear me in battle, when I am protecting what I love. But you get to see everything else. The part that laughs, the part that loves, the part that is just Draven. Just Draven is my favorite part, I whispered. He smiled, that rare, beautiful smile that was mine alone now. And I thought about that night at the banquet, when I spilled wine, made a reckless comment born of terror and honesty, and made the executioner prince smile for the first time in years. Who knew wine and audacity could change everything? Who knew that refusing to fear someone could save them? The blade of silence, the executioner prince, the weapon forged by tragedy and sharpened by duty. Until a kitchen servant spilled wine, looked him in the eye, and reminded him he was more than the sum of his scars, more than the title he carried, more than the deaths he had delivered. Sometimes, the most revolutionary act is refusing to fear someone who expects it. Sometimes, love is the only thing sharp enough to cut through armor. Sometimes, the person who saves you is the one you never see coming. And sometimes, a spilled glass of wine changes everything. If you're still here, I know you enjoyed that. Make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. And leave me a comment. Where are you listening from? It means more than you think to see how far this reaches. I'll be waiting for you in the next one.